thinking about threats to freshwater resources in these island environments, because I think we can break those threats into there's climate variability and the risk of drought. And so that security of supply. Another issue is around water quality. And the third issue is around climate change. So you can see there in the top left, there's a water tanker that's providing water into buckets for people who have run out of water. That would be occurring during a period of drought, or it could have occurred after a tropical cyclone where water has been contaminated and is not safe to use. There are a number of sources of contamination. Culturally, pigs are a really important source of protein and also of celebration in the Pacific. And they are associated with fecal contamination of surface and groundwaters, and human fecal contamination occurs. You know, lagoon latrines can sometimes be used still. And, you know, we go back to the whole issue of what is safe and adequate sanitation. So water and sanitation go hand in hand when we're looking at ensuring that people have access to safe, clean drinking water. That top right image is one that a master's student of mine took. It's particularly interesting. This comes from the Solomon Islands in the Western South Pacific, where a lot of rural people have moved into the perimeters around the city of Honiara and are squatting. They're in sort of informal or illegal settlements that don't have access to mains water supply. So what they do is illegally tap into the mains water supply using this tubing, this sort of polyurethane tubing. And that's the sort of spaghetti of black piping that you can see. And women and children there are collecting their water illegally from main supply. And right near the front of that image is a little child that's squatting and doing a poop right at the point where the women are collecting the water for drinking and cooking and bathing. So there's a really prime example of the risks of human fecal contamination of water because of a misunderstanding about the risk of pathogenic contamination and human health. Climate change, this other threat, you quite often see images of, you know, it looks as if islands are sinking under rising sea levels. Certainly those low islands are being impacted by storm surges, and with rising sea level, there's some ingress of the beaches and the houses that right on the edge of the beaches. But what you see there in that middle lower image of flooding of that house, you have that fresh groundwater lens because of differences in water density. Fresh water sits on top of saline or seawater. So as the sea level rises, it pushes the freshwater lens up so that it intersects the ground surface. So what you see there is actually groundwater that has risen above the ground surface. So sea level rise associated with climate change will impact freshwater resources through those storm surges and salination of the groundwater, but also you get the flooding because of the rising groundwater. And salination of groundwater is really important too with rising sea level, because if it comes into the root zone of food crops such as taro, it will kill those food crops. So really important aspects of food security as well as water security are impacted by climate change.
That is
and
so
then you get
fascinating. That's actually one element of climate change's impact on island communities that I was unaware of, was how it was actually going to be messing with the groundwater and like raising the
oh,
groundwater. That's fascinating.
yeah, and that's really the critical issue
Yeah.
with those low-lying atolls. And that's why you hear about certain island communities are now looking at migrating elsewhere because their island is being drowned
Mm-hmm.
as that groundwater rises. We can really summarize it as climate variability and water quality and climate change. And there's a significant amount of effort and attention that's placed on climate change. But in the immediate now, the issues are really about climate variability and access to adequate amounts of clean, safe drinking water, and the need to really make sure that clean, safe water, and adequate sanitation are addressed as key issues. And I am in no way downplaying the importance of climate change, because there are whole communities that are having to think about moving away from their ancestral homes because their islands are being lost, or the shorelines, the coastlines are being lost. But the immediate high risks that they're facing, these communities are facing, are around health issues associated with not enough water or poor quality water. And I think we always need to be aware of those two other issues. And look, I'm just going to finish off by, just considering that these are vulnerable communities. These are communities with very rich cultural histories. I consider the people of the Pacific to be the greatest mariners of human history. And they are such unique, powerful people that really do require our respect and our support in providing opportunities to build resilience within these sort of environmental vulnerabilities, and assistance in adapting to a highly dynamic and changing environment, and support in mitigating some of the effects of climate change, as well as mitigating some of those effects of climate variability. So I would end here by saying this is an absolutely beautiful part of the world with a rich culture. I hope some of you actually end up being able to visit this region after COVID has settled down, and to understand something more of what I always call my beautiful Pacific. So I'll end there. Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Nona.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, that was lovely. And what you just said about the people of these island communities, it was really beautiful. And I think it's such an important thing to mention, because for a lot of people, they see these as vacation destinations, and that's the purpose that they serve, and like how incredible it must be to be able to live on these islands, and like what a dream, and when in reality it's challenging, and they are going to be the first displaced people of climate change. And it's right. So important to recognize that.
That's right. And it's interesting that you raised that point, Nona, because I'm sure many of your students would have seen in the supermarket bottles of Fiji water. You may have seen Fiji water. So Fiji Water is a company on that large island of Viti Levu in Fiji. And it was established, the company was established by an American who had lived in Fiji for many years and bought the lease to the land from the local indigenous Itākei people as 99-year lease. And in sort of respect of the Matakali, the people, the tribes there, he provided opportunities for employment and education as well, and was very supportive of the Matakali. But that was bought out. That company was bought out by an American couple, a billionaire couple, who have since changed the face of that particular company. It's down in the sort of the floodplains, mountains rising above, and it's this massive industrial site with the American flags flying. But the actual volume of water that exists in that aquifer is unknown. The hydrogeology has not been done. So the sustainability of that resource is not done. But if you look at the marketing of that particular company, it's all about paradise. And you know, you've got a picture of the I think it's the hibiscus flower on the bottle, and the marketing is all about paradise. But if you go to the site, it's highly industrial, and it is not respectful of the Itākei indigenous people's land on which it stands. I'd really highly recommend. I can send you a copy of a paper that's extremely readable about Fiji Water. And it's just one issue of the export of water from an island to rich developing countries where that volume of water is not known. It's a fascinating case study. There are gendered aspects to water as well. You know, a few years ago, there was a very severe drought in the western part of Viti Levu in Fiji. And, you know, crops started to fail. The sugar production was very low. And so, you know, generally, you know, the men were the ones who are out in the agricultural sector doing a lot of the work. And there wasn't much work to do. So men didn't have much to do. But there was so little water that they were carting water in to families, with 44-gallon drums of water being enough to last a family for a week. And so the women were having to manage that water for drinking and cooking and bathing and so on. But the men were outside, and culturally, what were they doing? They were chatting and having a nice sort of relaxing yarn and drinking kava, which is a cultural activity. Kava is derived from a root of a plant, and it's macerated with water and then drunk, and it's sort of slightly hypnotic. But it needs water. So the men were using the water, precious water, for kava drinking because they weren't working. And the women were having to deal with this being another extraction of very precious water from what they had to manage over a week. The women were not pleased, I can tell you. So there's some really interesting interviews that one of my PhD students did between the men and the women, and how they were using water and how they were valuing water very differently.
That's so interesting. And, you know, you see similarities in kind of the gendered relationships with water in, you know, countries like India, I mean, really all over the world. I could think of probably several examples even here in America of how men and women use water differently, and how, and a lot of different examples. And it's just so interesting to see that that's kind of a common theme that you can find all over the world, is these gendered relationships with water. And I think a lot of times when people are first starting to learn about water, gender is not one of the first things that comes into their head as how people may associate with water, use water differently. And so I think that's a really important example to bring up.
Yeah, that's right. And in developing countries, gender and water is really key. It has profound implications for the health and education of girls and women. And their ability to participate in water management decision making. So one of just, maybe the last point here for the tourism that's involved with us going out there, people from developing countries going out into these island environments for their experience of a bit of tropical paradise. There are all of these resorts being built and marinas being built. If you have a really close look at that infrastructure, you'll see that there's a lot of rock used. So there are rocks for seawalls, rocks for road building, rocks that are built for the actual buildings themselves as aggregate in concrete. That rock has to come from somewhere. And where it generally comes from is quarrying of rivers.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
And so the rock is removed from rivers, crushed and made into smaller rocks or aggregate, and then it can be exported overseas, or it can be used for building infrastructure. But it compromises the river at the place of extraction and also downstream, where fish nurseries and coastal fisheries are severely impacted because of sedimentation, loss of water quality. So fish catch, and again, food security and water security are impacted. So the development of tourism can have this unexpected and invisible impact on water quality in the river systems on those high islands.
It's such a good example of like truly how interconnected everything is, regardless of what you're doing there, who you are, where you've come from, like there's impacts, there's interconnectedness that's happening.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. No matter what we do, we leave some sort of footprint, some sort of impact. And it's not necessarily visible where we're physically located.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sara, for your wonderful commentary on the islands of the South Pacific. It's another great Tom Talk, and we'll be doing more of these in the future. Take care.
Thank you.
Oh.
Oh, there you go.
Have to get all the business.
You might as well be a radio.
Well, we both could. We all
your
could.
Voice,
We could.
your voice is smooth as honey, Tom.